Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we're exposing the lies that lie behind Israel Apartheid Week that sows seeds of hatred and discord against the Jewish people and against Israel on our university campuses. So warm welcome to the programme, and today's guest is all the way from north of the border in Scotland, good friend of the programme, Michael McCann. Michael, great to see you on the programme.
Thank you, Simon. Good to be back.
Excellent. And for our viewers, we know that you are doing tremendous support with your various campaigns to kind of mobilise support for Israel and the Jewish people, and to really let and educate our members of parliament and those in government about the importance of standing with Israel. So in Hebrew, kol hakavod for the work that you do. But also, can you share some recent successes, some updates on the work you've been doing on behalf of Israel-Britain Alliance?
Well, first of all, the Israel-Britain Alliance would be nothing without our supporters. So for all your viewers that support our work, can I say thank you very much. And for those that haven't yet supported the work, if you can, we would be, again, most grateful. But this is the bottom line. When I was a Member of Parliament 2010 to 2015, I received 0 pieces of correspondence from people who were supportive of the Jewish state of Israel. Conversely, I received lots of correspondence from people who hated Israel and very much supported our opponents in the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and other extreme groups. And they were very upset when I had to write back to them and say, no, I'm not going to boycott Israel. I'm not going to criticise Israel because they live in a very dangerous part of our world. And I stand up for Israel, not just for the Jewish people, but for what Israel has given to the world since its rebirth in 1948. So that's what I face, but now we've changed that. We've turned things entirely on their head. Last year, we sent 150,000 pieces of correspondence, individual pieces of correspondence, our supporters, to MPs, government ministers and other targets. And our achievements, quite frankly, they're getting longer and longer, Simon. You remember when we started all this, but Hamas banned, Hezbollah banned. The British government finally voting against anti-Semitic motions and work at the United Nations. We got the government to recognise that the money that taxpayers sends to the Palestinian Authority is being abused and being spent on supporting terrorist salaries. So lots of work done, lots of achievements, but much more to do.
So can you remind our viewers how they can get involved and how they can get involved in some of your very targeted political campaigns on behalf of Israel?
Well, what many people have said to us from the very beginning is that not everyone's confident about how to address a politician or to write to a CEO of a company. So what we do is we do that hard graft, we create the message, and we have a system which allows people to very easily join our campaigns, and all they need to do is to go to our website, www.israelbritain.org.uk, and the first thing that they'll see is the live campaign in front of them. Click on that image, and that is just a few easy steps away from joining our campaign and becoming a supporter of the Israel-Britain Alliance.
Excellent. And can you share with us your latest campaign, really exposing the lies that lie behind Israel Apartheid Week? Absolutely shameful that we're seeing these week-long events across our universities, across the Western world, when they're nothing but generating hatred against Israel and, of course, the byproduct of Israel Apartheid Week is the increase in anti-Semitism and antagonism shown against Jewish students.
Yeah, I welcome the opportunity, Simon. Israel Apartheid Week is organised by extremists, our opponents in organisations like the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And it sounds a bit of a misnomer, but they run for more than a week. It usually starts from mid-March to mid-April. And how the event manifests itself in university campuses is that they will have various guest speakers and events, people like Ilan Pappé, who will speak at these events, but they'll also have fake barricades, for example, in front of university libraries, checkpoints where devised to look like Israeli checkpoints in order to try and create this concept that somehow Israel discriminates against people in its own country. What that does, it does two things. One, it makes Jewish students feel unsafe on British university campuses. And the second thing it does is it breaches the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which states in one of the examples that to describe Israel as a racist endeavour is anti-Semitic. So what our campaign seeks to do this time around is we've identified all the universities in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales that have not yet adopted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and we will allow our supporters, because there's education ministers in each nation of the United Kingdom, to write to that minister and saying, what are you doing about these universities that have failed to sign up to the IHRA definition? Now, the longer term plan is once all universities have signed up to the definition, then if they still hold these events, then the question has to be for each of the nation states in the UK, what's the point of having a definition of anti-Semitism when people break it, you do absolutely nothing about it? So it's a layered approach to put more pressure on government to do more about the oldest racism of all, the oldest hatred, anti-Semitism.
So let's have a look now at the latest campaign video produced by Israel-Britain Alliance that exposes the lies that lie behind Israel Apartheid Week.
Black people in South Africa suffered decades of injustice under apartheid. Apartheid began in 1948, but separating black Africans from the white minority had long been a policy aim. Laws made white people officially superior, and a large black majority faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. There were separate public facilities, and separate schools. But step by step, the apartheid establishment crumbled. And after being released from prison in 1990, Nelson Mandela was declared president, just 4 years later. In stark contrast, when the State of Israel declared its independence, on May 14, 1948, it was an emphatic statement of freedom and equality. It stated, Israel will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. The claim that Israel is an apartheid state is a simple lie, created by Palestinian leaders who cannot countenance negotiating borders, land, security, Jerusalem and refugees with the Jewish state. And that lie is distributed by extremists in UK university campuses that we, as taxpayers, fund. That's not only dishonest, it is anti-Semitic. If you agree, click the link attached to this communication and join our campaign today, and, if you can, distribute the links on social media.
A great video there produced by Michael himself, and it's so important that all of us get involved in this campaign, because we can't continue to allow the demonisation of Israel to continue on our university campuses. Michael, can you give us a bit of historical background into Apartheid Week? What are the objectives behind it? And also, why have so many universities allowed this to take place on their campuses when effectively their message is one of hatred, it's one of discord, and it's all based on a lie?
Well, it's developed over the years because It was actually created in Canada, and they must have been sitting around a table one day and say, how can we attack Israel? What's the best way to do it? And the conclusion they reached, these in their warped minds, was to let's undermine the state of Israel. So if you go back to how Israel started in its roots, David Ben-Gurion was a Labour politician. You know, there was always there was a kibbutz, there was a concept of collectivity. If you like, it was probably closer to the sort of communist state rather than anything else. But you know, over the years, the approach was always by the Labour politicians, Golda Meir and others who followed David Ben-Gurion, was to try and achieve peace with the Arab nations. They always wanted peace. But it was always thrown back in their face, because we know the history of the 1948 war, which the Arab armies started against Israel the day after they declared independence, on the 15th of May 1948. We know about the miraculous victory of Israel in the Six-Day War. We know, and some people forget, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And then when they realised that they couldn't defeat Israel militarily, what did they do? They resorted to blowing up men, women and children in their terrorist activities and the intifadas. And despite the fact that numerous offers of peace have been put on the table, most notably with Yasser Arafat, Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak when he was the Prime Minister of Israel, there's never been a peace deal, because the Palestinians, previously the Arabs, because if you go back to who the Palestinians were, there was Palestinian Jews in terms of the British Mandate's palace, as well as Palestinian Arabs. If you go back to it, they don't want peace with Israel because they don't want Israel to exist. So the people in Canada who created Israel Apartheid Week, it's all about undermining Israel, to claim it's not a legitimate democracy. But of course, the biggest laugh on those individuals, the biggest joke is it is a democracy, despite all the terror threats it faces. It's a democracy, and I think the biggest example I can give is that there are Arab members of the Knesset. There are Arab members of the current governing coalition in Israel. How can you possibly discriminate against Arabs when they're part of the legislature? So it makes a mockery of the whole thing. But because it's been there for such a long time and it's grown arms and legs, and it's, you know, younger students who can be manipulated in terms of being told a different history about Israel, it's become an annual event in our university campuses. Now, we've been successful over the years to diminish it and to make sure that there's as few events taking place as possible. But it's got to be eradicated. I don't mind if anyone wants to listen to the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign or Ilan Pappé. That's free speech, but they cannot do it. They cannot do it under the banner of Israel Apartheid Week without it being a racist event.
Absolutely. And the fact that we have to call out the way that they've classified this week by calling it apartheid, comparing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians or the Israeli Arabs to being that of an apartheid, is an appalling slur to be put on Israel. I mean, you and I have been to Israel many times, and remember going on Jerusalem. There is not two separate trams, one for Jews, one for Arabs and one for Christians. There are no separate toilets, one for Jews and one for Arabs. You know, there is no separation between East and West Jerusalem. I mean, it's a very much integrated Israeli city. Yes, you have the Israeli side, we also have the kind of Arab side in East Jerusalem, but they are still an integrated city. And nowhere do you see beaches for only Jews. You may have a beach for the ultra-Orthodox, but that's it. But you know, how can they? I'm talking about the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the War on Poverty, and others that have aligned themselves with this anti-Israel movement, can be allowed to say that Israel's an apartheid state when Israeli Arabs play such a massive role in Israeli society?
Well, you know something, when I was younger and I was growing up, and I wish I had the knowledge now that when I was 20, we all do that. But you know, when I looked at Israel and what it achieved, this tiny little nation in the southeastern shores of the Mediterranean, I thought to myself, I must be wrong. There must be something in the history. Because I was a member of the trade union movement, I was a member of the Labour Party, so why is there such animosity against Israel? I must be missing something. And then I looked through all the history again, and I found that I wasn't the person that was missing something. It was the people who were telling me that Israel was this and Israel was that. The bottom line is, if the history, the facts cannot lie. But let me tell you what the biggest slur about the apartheid slur is, as far as I'm concerned. South African apartheid was real.
Yeah.
black people were discriminated against. It was a policy aim, as our video said, that there should be discrimination and segregation. And when that was torn down, when Nelson Mandela finally walked free and became the president just 4 years after his incarceration ended, then and apartheid was stripped down, then that was a momentous time for geopolitics. But the people who made the sacrifices to get to that point, their work is diminished by those people in Canada that created the whole concept of Israel apartheid.
Yeah. Michael, I just want to read out this statement here. This is from the, according to the War on Want, there is a statement in support of Israel Apartheid Week, and this is what they say on their website. It says, War on Want has long recognised Israel's system of domination based on institutionalised racist discrimination as the crime of apartheid. As Palestinian activists, scholars and civil society organisations have been documenting for decades, increasingly international human rights organisations, UN officials and legal experts are all reaching the same consensus that Israel is an apartheid state as defined by under international law. And again, this is what they're saying without any real facts to back that up. But when we look at the real apartheid, that's in the Arab world, isn't it? And it's also within the Palestinian Authority. Why don't they examine the Palestinian authorities or Hamas's treatment of their own people, which is barbaric and absolutely horrific?
Well, it was Goebbels that said if you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it. And we see from the tragedy of Ukraine that the Russian people have been denied the truth by their state television. If you keep on repeating a lie often enough, that's what they think. And War on Want, you should remember who one of the officials of War on Want was around probably about 35 years ago, George Galloway. Gorgeous George as he was known. And so therefore, if you want to know the politics and where these people come from, just look at their history and who was involved with them. George Galloway was one of them. The position is that the Palestinians do not want to negotiate peace because they believe that whether it takes 100 years or 200 years, they don't care how many people die for the cause that they believe in, which is to get rid of Israel. So that's why they use lies instead of dealing with the facts and dealing with truth and actually negotiating with their opponents.
So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report. This one is entitled False and Biased and Anti-Semitic, Israel Blast Amnesty International Report on Accusations of Apartheid.
Israel is rejecting what it calls false allegations in the Amnesty report.
Instead of seeking the truth, Amnesty echoes the same lies shared by terrorist organizations. 5 minutes of serious examination would be enough to know that the so-called facts in the report published by Amnesty this week are delusional and disconnected from reality.
Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid charging that Amnesty doesn't call Syria, Iran, or other corrupt and murderous regimes apartheid states.
I hate to use the argument that if Israel wasn't a Jewish state, no one at Amnesty would dare make such a claim against it. But in this case, there's simply no other explanation.
The report is entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. Amnesty's executive summary says Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, wherever it has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948. A Wall Street Journal editorial calls it, quote, a libel that distorts history. Israel was founded in the wake of the Holocaust with broad international support. The report is a denunciation of the very existence of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people. Amnesty International says it's using the international definition of apartheid. But apartheid typically refers to the system of racial separation that gave whites superiority over blacks in South Africa until the early 1990s. Israeli attorney Ian Hertzberg from the NGO Monitor says the report is aimed at questioning the legitimacy of Israel's existence.
The charge is powerful because it is an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitic tropes to transform the conflict into one of from one of disputed lands and Arab rejection of Jewish presence in the Middle East to one of Jewish racism.
Israeli attorney David Benjamin grew up in South Africa. He says there's no comparison.
I was certainly a witness to the iniquities of that terrible system. And let me be absolutely clear, I've been living in Israel for the last 30-odd years, and there is absolutely nothing in common between the system of apartheid that applied in the old South Africa and the current situation in Israel.
Excellent report there, done by Chris Mitchell from CBN, and just a reminder that you can watch his programme, Jerusalem Dateline, on Revelation TV. Michael, I want to add in this because when we see that recently published report by Amnesty International that deals with human rights abuses coming up on their headline report that Israel is an apartheid state, doesn't this just fuel the organisers behind Israel Apartheid Week to say, look, Amnesty International have come out with a report saying that Israel is an apartheid state, and therefore they quote Amnesty International to give them their legitimacy, even though that whole report is absolutely flawed and is a pack of lies.
Well, you know something, when I was growing up and I was a younger person and a younger man, you know, you looked in organisations like Amnesty International and you thought, you know, what a fantastic organisation, looking after people who are imprisoned wrongly and some of the dictatorships across the world. Amnesty International has lost any remaining semblance of integrity that it ever had. And the answer to your direct question is this: they all work together, Simon.
Absolutely.
All the people in Amnesty International work with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, work with Stop the War Coalition, the very people that are supporting Putin's war now. They all work together. This was a planned event, this report being issued, because as soon as it was issued, you saw all the usual suspects in social media, oh my goodness, as if they didn't know it was coming. It was all planned, and it's all absolute nonsense. And I'm quite frankly embarrassed because for Amnesty International, not only are they wrongly claiming that there's apartheid inside Israel, they're actually claiming that the very existence of Israel is an apartheid. Where's Israel to go? Where is Israel to go? Surely if you take that argument to its logical conclusion, you are talking about genocide, you're talking about the second genocide of the Jewish people. It's a scandal, and quite frankly, Amnesty International, their supporters, and all the people that sit in their little rooms and work out these devastating, or what they think will be devastating tactics and strategies, should hang their heads in shame.
Absolutely. When it comes down to your campaign, how many universities and institutions of higher education are permitting the hatred and lies against Israel and the Jewish people by having Israel Apartheid Week at their campuses, but also for not signing up to the International Holocaust definition on anti-Semitism?
Well, it differs by country, but let's just say that Scotland, England and Wales all signed up to the international definition of anti-Semitism, IHRA definition, around 2017. Theresa May announced it in December 2016. Northern Ireland didn't come on board until last year, 2021, but with the greatest respect to them, I recognise our politicians did a tough job because, of course, Sinn Féin, the Green Trotskyites, didn't want that to happen because they know their allegiance to the Palestinian cause, all terrorists, of course. In terms of the countries themselves and the breakdown, England leads the way with the number of universities that have signed up to the IHRA definition because the Department of Education, to be fair, put a lot of pressure on universities to sign up. In Scotland and Wales, there's around about 9 or 10 universities in Scotland haven't signed up. There's about 7 or 8 in Wales that haven't signed up. Here's a curious point. In England, to use examples, we've got the SOAS, which is the University for African Studies, which refuses to sign up to the IHRA definition. And then you've got the London School of Economics, very renowned school. And what they've done, they've not signed up to the definition, they've cherry-picked it. They've taken the sentences that suit them, which is not an adoption of the IHRA definition. So what we're saying to each of the education ministers is, these are the universities, here's a list that our supporters can send in a letter to them and saying, these haven't signed up to the definition. What are you now going to do to encourage these universities to sign up to the definition? And if they don't, if they refuse to do so, what action are you going to take? Now, they've hidden in the past behind the free speech argument. But of course, I demolished that a few moments ago by saying, I don't mind, they can have any of these people speaking in their universities. They can't do it under the banner of Israel Apartheid Week.
Absolutely. And now, one aspect of this one, how much of these universities, we know about kind of the foreign funding of our universities, and particularly coming from the Middle East, is also contributing to anti-Israel sentiment on our university campuses?
Well, my view on it would be, Simon, the more important issue is that we as taxpayers,
absolutely,
everyone watching this programme, most people will be contributing or will have contributed their taxes to the university system, and therefore we are paying for this to take place. And that's why the fig leaf that the vice chancellors of universities hold up, which is, well, if we did this, we'd be interfering with free speech, is not only nonsense because it's factually incorrect, but they should bear in mind that they're covered by the public sector equality duty in terms of making sure all the students can learn in a safe environment, but also they receive money from the taxpayer. So I personally find it unacceptable that as a taxpayer they're allowing an event or events to take place on the campus that I pay for, I fund as a taxpayer, which is racist. It wouldn't be tolerated if it was racist because of the colour of someone's skin. It wouldn't be tolerated if it was someone with a disability that was being made to feel unsafe. And so therefore, why are we tolerating it when this is the oldest form of racism that the world has ever known?
Absolutely. And Michael, just want to kind of draw your point to universities and why they haven't really signed up to this International Holocaust Alliance definition on Jew hatred, because, I mean, it refers to attacking or racial slurs against Jewish people, but also, as you said, it's saying that Israel is a racist state. It's also making statements that Israel has no right to exist. And of course, big part of this also should be also classified that Israel has been classified as an apartheid state. All false claims, all designed to demonize Israel. And surely when you allow Israel to be attacked at our university campuses, you're also then attacking freedom of speech and academic freedom of expression, aren't you? So you're bringing into question the whole operation that is our universities and the freedom that students are able to learn and gain knowledge and understanding without being indoctrinated with hatred.
Yeah, well, you know, you have this caricature of university lecturers where they're all walking around with caftans and open-toed sandals, and they're all sort of the hippie types. Well, I'm afraid that that is a reality in many aspects of university life, that we've got people who are completely and utterly detached from real world events and real life, making statements and filling their students' heads full of nonsense. And it's because it's the whole debate about Israel and the Palestinians has been going on for so many decades that the world has become, and Israel, quite frankly, is to blame for this, because they adopted an isolationist policy for a time, which is to say, we don't care if nobody likes us. The bottom line is we're here, we're going to exist. And they forgot that they had to win the propaganda war as well. And we, as Israel supporters or Israelis, left that stage vacant to allow the extremists to move in and to start all this sort of made-up nonsense about apartheid and how Israel treats people badly. Now, the issue about who treats people badly is pretty simple. That there is disputed territory. That's the territory that Israel took in the 1967 war. The Sinai was handed back to the Egyptians when the peace deal was signed. And that was part of Land for Peace, which satisfied the Resolution 242, the United Nations resolution that was passed to say that, yeah, we need to get peace and it will be exchanged for land. But when they call things like the occupied territory or occupied Palestinian territory, that is factually incorrect. The Palestinians have never had that territory. It's disputed territory. And the reason it's still disputed is because the Palestinians won't sit down at a negotiation table and talk peace with the Israelis. That's a hard facts.
No, absolutely. And of course, Jordan controlled that territory really from 1948 until 1967.
Correct.
Before then, the British held it, and then before then, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So there's never been a Palestinian state. There's never been a Palestinian president. There's never been a Palestinian currency or a Palestinian stamp. And there hasn't really been a Palestinian people until the 1970s when the PLO invented it.
Yeah,
So
and the biggest laugh,
there we
of
go.
course, is that when they call it colonialism, the creation of the Israeli state defeated colonialism, because it was a time when Britain controlled a part of the world they had no right to control. We gave back, India became India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. We freed people from the oppression of colonialism, if they want to call it that, although Britain gave a lot to the world as well. And that was part of the world that was freed as well. So it's rather ironic that the reverse in history.
Absolutely. I remember my time, I mean, it's quite a long time ago now, in the kind of mid-90s at the University of Manchester, and knowing then how Jewish and Israeli students were pretty much under fire. And in the mid-90s, University of Manchester had the biggest JSOC, in other words, the biggest Jewish union in the whole of the country. It was a university that many Jewish people wanted to attend, but sadly what we've seen now is it's become one of the smallest because of the attack on Jewish students, and generally Jewish students not feeling safe at universities, having to hide their identity. I remember a time after spending my first time in Israel, it was 3 months with a Hebrew University of Jerusalem program. Benjamin Netanyahu, during his first term as Prime Minister, opened the tunnel under the under the Western Wall in Jerusalem. That sparked massive Palestinian violence and attacks on Israeli soldiers. It started off with an Israeli Palestinian Authority police shooting Israeli soldiers, and we had a little bit of a conflict for a few days. It wasn't until I came back to university back in October of 1996 that the Islamic Society wanted to ban the Jewish Union because of its association with Israel. There wasn't anything like an apartheid week, but we could see there was so much hostility towards Israel, and also that Jewish students were increasingly feeling unsafe. And of course, that's now completely out of hand, where many Jewish students are very fearful about attending our universities. This also does stoke up Jew hatred against our Jewish students, doesn't it, on British campuses?
Of course it does, because the evidence is overwhelming. Last year, when Hamas launched its attacks against Israel, the most vicious rocket attacks we've seen for an awful long time, then there was a huge upsurge of anti-Semitism in our country, in the United Kingdom, when we saw, if you recall, Simon, in North London, cars going past with people shouting horrific things from windows, which I won't even say because they're too horrific, with the Palestinian flags against Jewish people. And the bottom line is what really concerns me is that when people talk about anti-Zionism, now Zionism is a very straightforward thing. I'm a Zionist, I'm a Christian Zionist. I believe that Israel had the right to self-determination in its ancient homeland, which is where it is right now. So therefore, if you're anti-Zionist, that must mean that you're not for Israel having a home in its ancient homeland. So therefore, that means that Israel must be removed. Where are these people to go? Where are the nearly 2 million Israeli Arabs to go? Have they to go as well, or can they stay? And so when we hear politicians saying this, I don't understand why they're not immediately leaped upon by journalists who would then ask them the question, are you in favour of destroying the Israeli state where it is just now? Because that's a logical consequence of what they're actually arguing for.
No, absolutely. But no, we don't have journalists of that calibre anymore, I'm afraid, and they don't know enough, and that's the part of the problem. But when it comes down to Israel, if we reflect on Israeli society, and actually the CEO of Israel's largest bank is an Israeli Arab. We also see that an Israeli Arab judge has convicted a president and a prime minister who are both now in jail. We've also seen that Israeli Arabs have an open and free press, and at the moment we see that the main Arab party in this coalition between Bennett and Lapid actually is the kingmaker in the Israeli Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. So when you say that Israel is an apartheid state, and yet the Israeli Arabs are kind of flourishing and have so many opportunities, more so than anywhere else in the Arab world or the Middle East, doesn't this actually bring shame upon them? And we know that Israel is encouraging more Israeli Arabs to speak up and defend Israel against this awful racial slur that Israel is an apartheid state.
It goes back to my thoughts as a young person, Simon. I when I heard all these things about anti-Israel stuff, I searched and searched and searched for the reasons that people could reach those conclusions, and then I realised it was all make-believe. It was all made up. And when the people who sit on the Israeli Supreme Court, who are Arabs and Druze and other backgrounds, they're not there because it's a fix. They're not there because somehow there's a puppeteer behind them pulling their strings. Similarly, when it comes to those that serve in the Israeli Defence Forces, the Druze officers, the Muslim officers and soldiers, they're not there because it's a fix. They actively stand up and speak out against us. But what we need in this country is that we need our politicians to be braver. And I was at an event last night in central London, and I met a group of 16 and 17-year-old Jewish students who were there with the Jewish National Fund, learning and increasing their knowledge about their Zionism. They're going to be the future. But I explained to them that from my perspective as an older person, that they needed to speak out, they needed to be brave, and they needed to be proud of not only their religion and their faith, but they also had to be proud of their Zionism too.
Absolutely. So let's go to this excellent video, and this is produced by Emily Schroeder and also Yosef, and this is them talking about Israel being an apartheid state. This is one of the best videos out there.
Yale University student government just passed a resolution claiming that Israel is committing ethnic cleansing and genocide.
But from 1967 until today, the population of Jerusalem has gone from 26% Arab to 38% Arab.
In 1948, there were 150,000 Arab citizens in Israel. Today, there are more than 1.9 million Israeli Arabs, including me.
The total Palestinian population, Gaza and the West Bank, has increased 9 times since 1948. In Gaza, the population has gone from 60,000 in 1948 to over 2 million today.
Since Israel's first major operation in Gaza in 2008, the population has increased from 1.4 million to 2.1 million.
In fact, according to the Palestinian government, there has never been a decrease in Palestinian population in any Palestinian city for as long as they provide statistics.
Does any of that sound like ethnic cleansing or genocide to you?
For comparison's sake, the Jewish population in Europe in 1933 was about 9.5 million. In 1950, it was 3.5 million.
Now that's genocide.
The same week that Yale did this, a rabbi was stabbed on the streets of New England.
Coincidence?
Not at all. It's irresponsible to make exaggerated smears against Israel, especially when these are being used to excuse anti-Semitic violence.
Yale is supposed to be one of the top universities in the world.
Yet apparently, their students aren't smart enough to know the definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide.
And I thought Yale is hard to get into.
And that's certainly one of the best videos out there that exposes the lies that Israel is an apartheid state. What I love about that video, Michael, so much is showing how much the Israeli Arab population has increased, how the population of Gaza increased, even now the population amongst the Palestinian Authority. And of course, if Israel was carrying out an apartheid, if Israel was so-called oppressing the Palestinians, then that wouldn't be the case.
I share that view immediately, having watched that video as well, Simon. But you know the other thing, it makes me sad, because what Israel has, the Palestinians could have that as well if they hadn't been so poorly served by their leaders that don't care how many ordinary Palestinians have to be used as cannon fodder in order to achieve their aim of making sure that the state of Israel doesn't exist. That's the extremely sad part, because the bad news for them is that Israel is going absolutely nowhere.
Absolutely, which is good. I think we have to also recognise as well, and recognise where the kind of a real apartheid is taking place, and that is in the Arab world, and that the Palestinians living in Lebanon, living in Syria, are being bombed by Assad's regime, those living in Jordan, those living in the kind of Gulf states, they're treated as third-class citizens. They're not given citizenship, they're not given passports, they are told they can't enter into certain professions, they're told they have to only live in certain areas and certain territories. surely this is the real apartheid that's taking place against the Palestinians is in the Arab world, but the supporters of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, the BDS, clearly don't understand this truth, or they certainly don't want to know this truth.
They don't want to acknowledge it at all. The bottom line is that it's even worse. The international community have created this situation, because if you go back to the creation of the UNRWA, which is a refugee agency which was created purely for those who had been displaced after the 1948 war, a war, incidentally, that their leaders had started. So we have the 1948 war, there's an armistice in 1949. In 1949 we create UNRWA. Now UNRWA has got its own definition of a refugee. And many people don't know this, but these are the facts. A refugee, under Palestinian standards, it passes down the patrilineal line, which is through the father. So if I'm living in Palestine, then I give birth to a male child, or any children, I pass my refugee status, my victimhood, down to them. In contrast, the UNHRC, which is the United Nations Refugee Council, their definition of a refugee ceases once they adopt citizenship of a new country. So if a Syrian refugee comes to Britain and they become a British citizen, they're no longer a refugee. We have a situation where a bespoke policy was created for the Palestinians because their leaders did not want the problem to be solved. So when there was around 750,000 refugees created as a result of the 1948 war, which the Arabs started, they were not allowed to go back to their country, not by Israel, but by their own leaders. And what we then had is a situation that when the number should decrease every year, it's been going up. There's now around 18,000 original refugees left from that 1948 war. They're dying out every year in greater numbers. Believe it or not, there are nearly 7 million, under the UN's definition, Palestinian refugees, and they've been treated abysmally in places like Lebanon and Jordan, when all the things you've said about not being able to take jobs and employment and so on and so forth, all of that is 100% true.
Michael, when we look at this situation, isn't it absolutely appalling that ordinary Palestinians are being used as a political pawn, particularly those living in awful conditions in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, elsewhere in the Middle East, because they are then being used as a political weapon to eventually attack Israel. Now, those that support the Israel Apartheid Week, those who support the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, constantly say that Israel is racist because they won't allow the descendants of the 1948 War of Independence back into what is now Israel. And of course, with 7 million so-called refugees all flooding back into Israel, that means that Israel as a Jewish state is completely destroyed, and this is another weapon that's been used to attempt to destroy the nation of Israel, and that's why Israel can't accept it.
Well, there'd be a simple answer to that. In terms of the 850,000 Jews that were thrown out of Arab countries without being allowed to take anything with them, will they be allowed reciprocal status in each of the Arab nations, and all the descendants that have came since they were thrown out of those countries, will they be allowed that status? The answer, of course, would be no. Every year that passes, this situation gets more complicated because the international community, I was going to use a Scottish term there, a colloquial term, which I won't in case your viewers don't understand it.
It's good for our Scottish viewers, though.
Well, it'd be bottled. In other words, they've not made the tough decision. So instead of making the tough decision back in the late 1940s, and if they hadn't created UNRWA, then we wouldn't have 7 million made-up refugees. And many of these people have actually become refugees because they're signing up for the financial compensation that they hope someday will become available. So the international community have made huge mistakes, and now it's not about Israeli oppression or Israeli apartheid, it's about the Palestinian oppression of their own people. Absolutely. And what we must hope and pray is that one day there is a Palestinian leader who's brave enough not only to say this is all wrong, but I'm going to sit down and negotiate with my Jewish brothers and sisters to finally end this terrible, terrible conflict, which has inflicted so much pain on the people that I represent.
But do you think that's beginning to possibly change now with the onset of social media playing a huge role in influencing young people's decision making on the world around them? Also the impact of the Abraham Accords, the fact that we've got Israel normalizing relations with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates, also with Morocco, and formerly then with Sudan. There's even talks of bringing Indonesia into the Abraham Accords, which has the biggest Muslim population in the world, followed potentially by Saudi Arabia. And if this trend continues, then the Palestinian Authority and its leadership will find itself completely out of place and out of step with the rest of the Sunni Arab world, and that they will have a choice: either get along with their fellow Sunni Arab brothers and sisters in the Arab world, or they have a choice to back the extremists within the region, notably the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Qataris, the Turks, or the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, there's an awful lot going on, and there's a lot of geopolitics underneath that, because we know the difference between the Shia and the Sunni Muslims in Iran and its hegemonic ambitions for the region. But I think it's fascinating that there's a paradox here, because you've got the situation where the Abraham Accords have been a huge success. The UAE, Bahrain, all the countries that you mentioned, friendships building up there, trade taking place between Israel and these states for the first time ever. But yet we have the situation that in the West, our children our young people are getting fed a diet of lies in places, in university campuses, which you expect university campuses to be places of learning with all sorts of diverse debates going on. But they've been fed a debate, they've been fed complete lies, and they're actually against the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, believe it or believe it not, Simon, is against the Abraham Accords. They're against peace. I mean, what chance do we have of defeating these people when they're prepared to perpetuate these lies against the Jewish state? And its bottom line is it's anti-Semitic. The chance that we have is the one that groups and organisations like mine create by telling people the truth, getting more people engaged, and ensuring that we move into the arenas of social media where we can capture the younger audiences. Because the demographic of support for the Israel-Britain alliance and others has to change, because most of the people who will be watching this will remember, some of them will remember 48, a lot will remember 1967, 1973, I certainly do, the intifadas of the 80s and the 90s, but we have to teach our children, we have to pass on our knowledge, our wisdom, to ensure that we have keyboard warriors, as we described them before, keyboard warriors of Israel, but the new generation coming through. So we've got the TikTok warriors, we've got the Instagram warriors, we've got all the ways that people communicate, but put out the truth and combat the lies and deceit that is out there.
Yeah, which are absolutely essential. But how do we kind of engage young people in this kind of righteous cause of Israel? Because many young people are kind of apathetic to politics. They're apathetic to what's going on in the world. Maybe the war in Ukraine may be a wake-up call for them. And I'm not putting down young people at all, because they are the future, they are the next generation, and it's so important to equip and empower the next generation for this fight and this struggle. But I mean, Israel itself is a young people's country. It's not an old people's country. Israel's a very young, it's very dynamic. Israel's leading the world in terms of this IT technology and innovation that we're seeing around the world. So how do we encourage young people to get more involved and get involved in these campaigns? And why does it matter to them, I suppose, is the most important question.
Well, in my life as a politician, admittedly it was a while ago now, but I was always surprised that, I met young people who were indifferent. I met young people who were more interested in fashion and music than they were about geopolitics. But I've also met many young people who have been hugely impressive, including the young people that I met last night at the event I mentioned earlier on. And I'm confident that if we can communicate with younger people on their terms, not on ours, not on a 58-year-old man's terms with people who are 16, 17 and 18. I sometimes think I'm still 18, 19 and 20 inside here, but unfortunately the physical mass doesn't go along with the brain. But the bottom line is we need to communicate with those young people in the terms that they want to be communicated on. And that's what we have to learn as older people. And what I'm looking to do, particularly after speaking to those younger people last night and the younger people that I meet from time to time, is I want to give them the authority to say, look, you come up with your ideas, you tell me, don't let me tell you, you tell me how we frame the message, how we frame the truth, and how we get that truth out there. And I think I'm blessed by the fact that I've had the opportunity to meet these younger people, and I'm looking forward to great things in the future from them.
No, absolutely, which is so important, and also this kind of use of social media to advocate for Israel and to explain the truth of Israel. We saw there in those brilliant videos produced by Emily and Yosef in Israel, just really telling the truth in very short video clips, a couple of minutes, but just putting the truth out there and being social media influencers. We need to get them to see other like-minded people and show that the work they're doing regarding Israel and getting on board.
100% correct, but we must also think about those young Palestinians who have been brought into this world and who are here already, that have got a fruitless future to look forward to because of the people who purport to represent them. I feel just as badly for them as I do for the situation that we find ourselves in the UK, where people are fed a diet of untruths which allows them to reach the wrong conclusions. I've got friends that I've got to educate when they say things off the cuff and say, but that, you know that isn't true. I think it's extraordinary that Putin has started a war, but the British intelligence services and other intelligence services have immediately cut the feet from under him in terms of the lies that he's told. When he told us he was not going to invade Ukraine, and he did. The British intelligence services had intelligence. They didn't secret away. They told people. Jan Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace stood up and said, he's not telling the truth. So we've dispelled his lies in a matter of weeks, but we haven't dispelled the lies of the Palestinian leaders that have been given to us for decades. And surely there's something wrong there, and that lies in the political classes actually relearning the history, the facts, and making decisions from there which will help produce a peace settlement and not continue this conflict.
Absolutely. And Michael, for our viewers watching who are outraged at these claims that Israel is an apartheid state and the fact that our universities are being exploited to hold Israel Apartheid Week at their university campuses, which is inciting hatred against Israel and hatred and violence directed against the Jewish people. How can they get involved in your campaign, and what's the procedure?
Well, very simply, Simon, you have been a stalwart supporter, and I'll look directly at the camera. You've been a stalwart supporter of the Israel-Britain alliance from our inception. The Revelation TV has been from our inception too. Dead simple. Go to our website, www.israelbritain.org.uk. The first image you'll see, if you click on it, that will take you to the campaign page, which will allow you to sign up and become a supporter of the Israel-Britain alliance. And thereafter, that you'll get the regular communications about our campaign updates and what we're doing to ultimately, and I hope this doesn't sound too grand, but to make this world a better place, Simon.
Absolutely, which is important, but it's also important to hold our politicians to account, our members of parliament to account when it comes to Israel. And a lot of this, isn't it, is down to ignorance. A lot of this is down to not enough knowledge, and also how the other side persuade our members of parliament to think, because they present the evidence, there's more letters, there's more correspondence going to them. So they're only kind of seeing one side, they're not seeing the other side. As a former Labour MP, do you often find this, that members of parliament may not know so much on a particular issue and therefore are influenced by their own electorate on particular topics?
They're influenced, Simon, by their postbag, because I don't blame them. And when you're a member of parliament, you get correspondence on every subject, from school milk to nuclear weapons and everything in between. And you're expected to have an informed view. And quite frankly, there are some big brains inside parliament, but most of them are just ordinary people who have become elected representatives. And the bottom line is they've been fed a diet from the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign and others, which is simply untruthful. And the only way that we can combat that in our democracy is to feed them a diet of facts, truth. And that's why I am always delighted to say that I can go to sleep very easily at night, because I know that the work that I do is based on facts and truth.
Absolutely.
And, I can't ask for any more than that.
So Michael, great to see you back on the Middle East Report, and thank you for this latest campaign, and great that you can join us today.
Thank you, Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching this programme today. Please get behind Michael and the work of Israel-Britain Alliance in defending Israel, particularly this new campaign that is highlighting what is essentially evil the Israel Apartheid Week. We know that that is a slur. We know that that is not true. And that's why it's imperative that we call upon our political representatives and our government to take action against those universities that allow this to take place on their campus, because this spreads hatred against Israel. This also causes a rise of anti-Semitism, and it's got to stop. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.